The following is a recording of a live questions and answers session with Chris McCann that took place on Friday, July 12th, 2013.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Questions and Answers time for Friday evening. These broadcasts are live every Friday at about 9:30 p.m. Eastern, and this program is designed to interact with you with your questions and comments related to the Bible, and we'll try to respond as well as possible by going to the Bible. And so, with our Bibles at the ready, it's now time to turn things over to our speaker for this Friday evening Questions and Answers time and say hello to Chris McCann. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Friday night question and answer. Tonight, we're going to open up the room in just a minute to receive your phone calls with your questions or comments. And each person is invited to share whatever on your mind by contacting us in one of the ways that were just laid out for you, and we'll be happy to receive your call. And I'll try as much as possible to respond by turning to the Bible, as the Bible is God's Word. We have a short time together, so we're just going to begin by going to the first person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer. Please go ahead with your call.
Good evening, Chris. Could you read 1 Corinthians 11:6, and then I'll make my comment and ask my question?
Sure. 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 6, says, "For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered."
Well, my comment is that I'm a hairstylist, and my question is, if a female client requests to have a man's haircut or to shave all or part of her head, am I not to do it? And can you explain what this verse means?
Well, I can explain the spiritual meaning of this verse. Now, concerning your question, I think that we, each of us, needs to pray for wisdom in specific situations like that. There are some people that they're ill and they may need to have their hair cut very short, a woman, or even shaved, and they're in other words, I really wouldn't want to answer that. I think that you would have to ask God for wisdom and if it troubles you. But as far as what the Lord is saying here, we have to go back to verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 11, which says, "But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God." And God is establishing a chain of command, but he's also laying down some biblical principles that the head of every man is Christ, all right, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, it's interesting that the head of every man is Christ, and Christ is God, and the head of Christ, it says here, is God, and of course God is God. But it's the head of the woman is the man that doesn't seem to fit with the other two heads here, as the other two heads are eternal God himself. Until we understand that the man here is being used as a figure of the law of God or the Spirit of God, as mankind is married to the law. And then it'll make sense when we understand that if the head of the woman is the man, the law of God, then it makes sense that her head must be covered. But in verse 4, every man, who is the head of the man, according to verse 3, Christ, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonoreth his head, because there's no need to cover his head, because his head is said to be Christ. But in verse 5, every woman that prayeth or prophesieth, and to pray or prophesy would be to bring the gospel, with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head. Why? Because her head is spiritually the law of God. And the law of God is that which condemns and finds fault and sin, and it needs to be covered. Just like the Ark of the Testament inside the Holy of Holies was containing the Ten Commandments, and there had to be a cover placed over the ark of a mercy seat. The blood of the sacrificial animal would be sprinkled upon the mercy seat, which would cover over the ark. And that's the picture here that God is painting, that a woman praying or prophesying with her head being the law of God, with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. If she were shaven, that would mean her head would be naked. It's indicating her sins are exposed before God because the law is condemning her. And then in verse 6, for if the woman be not covered, that is, there's no covering over the condemnation of the law, Christ's blood isn't sprinkled over the ark that is pronouncing the condemnation, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. That is, shave her head to picture her spiritual nakedness before God. And that's really the point of what God is saying here. If a woman wears short hair, that's not really in view. Now, but today it is also true that some women are getting crew cuts or they're shaving their head, and that is going against the sign that God has placed of her hair. But if a woman styles her hair in a short way and still looks like a woman, I don't think there's any problem with that.
No, not at all. And I thank you for that, Chris. That was very helpful. I guess I was just troubled because there was a client that is a homosexual that shaved half of her head and wanted to make a statement, and I just didn't want to go against God's law to partake in that.
Yeah, I know it's difficult. I think no matter what a true believer does say, no matter what kind of work, we will probably encounter some instance where there is something going on that we're uncomfortable with, and that's why we just need to pray for wisdom and help. We need God's help to help us in the day as we work, and we can ask Him to help us to avoid traps and snares of men, because people will at times intentionally place us in those kind of circumstances in order to see what kind of response they get. And so we can ask God to help us at work, and that we be given wisdom and knowing what to do, so forth.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for your question. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our question and answer tonight. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay. I have two questions, and my second question will be more elaborate. I want to keep the first question kind of short. 2 Chronicles 20, verses 22 to 24, please.
2 Chronicles chapter 20, 22 through 24. 2 Chronicles 20, 22. And when they began to sing and to praise, Jehovah set ambushments against the children of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, which were come against Judah, and they were smitten. For the children of Ammon and Moab stood up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, utterly to slay and to destroy them, When they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, everyone helped to destroy another. And when Judah came toward the watchtower in the wilderness, they looked unto the multitude. Behold, they were dead bodies fallen to the earth, and none escaped.
Two things that are really interesting is that, three things, that the true believers were singing. They weren't actually taking part in the destruction of the unbelievers. Second thing is that the unbelievers actually destroyed one another. And thirdly, none escaped. And so what I was wondering is, the more I'm reading, I'm finding that I think that in these end times, this is a picture of what is actually going on, that the judgment is that they will destroy one another with the sin that they actually embrace. And my question is very simple, and really, if I could ask you just a yes or no answer, because I think my second question you will want to elaborate on more often. Do you begin to see that this is the case, that these verses kind of outline how things will end in our day as well? Just kind of yes or no, because I want to move on to my second question. Have you thought about this at all?
Do you mean the description here in 2 Chronicles 20?
Yeah. Does this description also fit how you think things are going on in our day?
Well, I would say I can't say no, because these verses do relate, but I think that God is very actively judging the wicked, and His actions of ending salvation, shutting the door of heaven, are ultimately what destroy them, and it leads to the multiplication of sin and the spiritual desolation of the church, and so on.
Okay, that's good. So my next question is, the other day, I think it was Wednesday, you were going through Revelation 9, and you were saying that you were kind of, as an overview, you were disputing others who say that Revelation 9 speaks about the church age, and you were teaching that it was not. And I'm not arguing that point, but my question is, if you could, I don't know if you want to read verses Revelation 9 verses 14 to 18. There's twice that the language, the third part, comes into view, and so you didn't touch on that the other day, and it kind of left me with some questions as to, we always thought that the third part, this language, really spoke about the church age. So maybe that might be what's misleading people. Would you like to take time now to elaborate why that language is not talking about the church age, that third part language?
Yes, I appreciate that. In Revelation 9, now first of all, Revelation 8 is a chapter that details God's judgment on the churches, and He identifies the churches and congregations of the world repeatedly as the third part. And anyone could read that, and you'll see it's again and again and again. The third part is under the wrath of God. And then in verse 13, after the first 4 trumpets have sounded, there's a transition made, and it says, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound."
If I can interrupt, also verse 12 is important because it talks about the third part of the sun, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of stars.
Right.
That also is indicating it's not the entire world that's under judgment at that time. So that's important also.
And right, because at this time God is actually saving a great multitude outside of the churches. We're still getting some feedback from your microphone.
I get too close to the computer. Go ahead. I'm good now.
Okay. Well, God is still saving a great multitude during the latter rain as He's bringing the judgment on the church. And then verse 13 is the verse that describes the transition from the judgment on the third part exclusively to now include the whole world. And the language of woe to the inhabitants of the earth Well, you'll find the same language in Jeremiah 25 when God does a very similar shift from judgment, which begins at the city called by those called by his name, to the nations. He says, will you be utterly unpunished? And then it speaks of the judgment coming to the inhabitants of the earth. Very similar language because it's describing spiritually the same truth. And so Revelation 9 is Judgment Day, May 21. And there's other ways of confirming that. But you have a good question, because after reading Revelation 8, well, we get to verse 12 of Revelation 9. It says, one woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter, and each of the woes identifies with the last three trumpets. And in verse 13, and the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loose, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. And it mentions that also in verse 18. By these three was the third part of men killed by the fire, by the smoke, and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. And we do tend to think, well, the third part, that's the church. And so it could lead some to conclude, well, okay, this is talking about the judgment on the church also. Well, it is, but it's the judgment on the church in the day of judgment on May 21. God judged them for 23 years. His judgment began at the house of God, and he was judging them while he was not judging the world in the sense of bringing a final judgment on mankind. Then on May 21, he shifted the judgment to include all the world, which also now the churches are a part of, and so the judgment falls on the third part in a final way, because while they were in the church, none within the churches and congregations could find salvation. They had to come out during the Great Tribulation's 23 years in order to experience salvation. And the vast majority, did not come out. Therefore, when the day came that the Great Tribulation ended, they went from a bad situation where they weren't being saved, but at least they had the possibility of salvation if they obeyed God and left their church. They could at least go out into a position where they might be saved. But on May 21, that possibility ended, and so all those within the churches were effectively killed on the day of judgment when this shift, this expansion occurred from the church to now all the world. And that's why the third part is said to be slain. And verse 18 also speaks of the third part being killed in both cases, because now their eternal fate is guaranteed. They can't go anywhere. They're dead because they weren't in a position where they could have possibly been saved prior to May 21, unlike the rest of the world. The other 5 billion about people, the rest of mankind, they aren't killed in the same way because they were at least in a position of potentially God having saved them through the hearing of this message. Even if they were an atheist or agnostic or the biggest critic of the approaching day of judgment that you can imagine, even if they mocked and ridiculed, at least they were outside the church, and so we could still pray for them. Oh Lord, having had mercy, is it possible you might have saved them before that day came? And even though it would seem very unlikely, yet there is that potential possibility from their perspective or from our perspective, and that possibility does not exist for anyone.
Can I jump in?
Yes, for
Can
anyone that is in the church.
As you were describing this, something new kind of came to me. Up until now, I've always thought that the loosing of the four angels. Now, the word angels is messengers, and four is going to be, like all the messengers. Well, I always thought that would mean that there was going to be a new coming forth of gospel of some sort, like there's something new to be proclaimed. But now, as you're talking, I'm seeing this differently. When verse 14 says, "Say unto the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the river Euphrates." That's the language I'm looking at as language of the rapture. That's what happened on May 21. All of God's elect, which were bound in the river Euphrates, were released. And it says, "And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year," which is really interesting because now I'm looking at this, that we were prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year. That's Judgment Day. And what's really interesting, and maybe it's nothing, I'm sure it's nothing, but it's four angels and hours, 1 day, month, year, basically 4 times 4, that's the number 16. I'm sure it's nothing, but what's interesting is that the four angels were loosed to slay the third part of men. So it was the loosing of the angels which slayed the third part of men.
Right.
And then further on, what's interesting is it says that and these were killed by the fire and the smoke but then further on it says, "And the rest," on verse 20, "and the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues." In other words, the 1/3 is up until now is pointing to the church, but then verse 20 brings the world in. The rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, that's the rest of the world, that yet repented not of the works of their hands. That's verse 20 and 21 is talking about what's going on in our day in the whole world.
Right. And
Is this the way you've tied it together?
Yes. Well, as far as the four angels, the four messengers that are loosed from the great river Euphrates, Euphrates identifies with Babylon, and this trumpet sound is occurring on May 21, the day of judgment, which, if we were to look at it with the historical parable of Israel and its 70-year period of captivity to Babylon, it was at the end of 70 years that they were loosed. And so the loosing from Babylon is when the Jews return to Zion, or they're delivered. And that is the salvation of God's elect, the four messengers. When we look at the book of Daniel, we find 4 main Jews that are mentioned. Actually, we only find 4 that are mentioned who were held captive in Babylon: Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. We only find 4 men that were very faithful men. You might find the reference to a king, that they were taken in a certain year of a Jewish king, but you won't read of any other Jew in the book of Daniel except those 4 men. And so they represent God's elect held captive in Babylon, and then following that period, they are loosed when King Cyrus takes the kingdom, and that pictures the loosing of God's elect, and God spiritually loosed all of his elect from the spiritual bondage of Babylon, Satan's kingdom, by May 21, and it was that act of loosing or saving all of his elect that kills the third part, because there's no other names to be found in God's book of life, and that means everyone else dies. And we know the third part dies because they were not in a position to be saved prior to May 21, and now they cannot after May 21. But the rest of the men, you see how you pointed out how God makes that difference. They're unrepentant sinners, but they were not killed by those plagues because we still have that possibility. Well, perhaps, we hope and pray, maybe, even though they're still involved in these things, we keep praying for them, and so they're in a different situation than those that in the churches were.
What's interesting, though, is that verse 15, it says that the 4 angels were loosed to slay the third part of men. And that ties in exactly with what you're saying, that God does this a lot. He starts one thought, then he interjects all this other information which breaks up the thought, and then he completes the thought. So the thought is that the 4 angels were loosed. That all that other information is additional, but then the conclusion of that thought is they were loosed to slay the third part of men. So it was the loosing of the angels which slay the third part of men, which is exactly what you just said. It was if you weren't saved by May 21, then the door is closed. There is no more salvation. But it's that loosing, that salvation for all God's elect, also from according to this verse, is what serves to slay the third part of men. Okay. All right, great. I appreciate that clarification. I learned something really new there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for your questions and bringing up those verses. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer. Please go ahead with your call.
I'll make it very good studies. Sometimes at night the phone kind of goes, the studies don't continue, but that's okay. I've got the internet if I want to listen to something again on EBible 2 or EBibleFellowship.com. The question about whether we should, be a hairdresser and, worry about cutting somebody's hair. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 12 and 13, if you want to look at that, it just says that we don't judge those on the outside anyway. They're not Christians, so it doesn't matter if they want to cut in a mohawk and, be a woman or whatever. Who cares?
Well, let me read that verse in 1 Corinthians 5:12. For what have I to do to judge them also that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within. And this is in the context of someone involved with fornication. And actually in 1 Corinthians 5, the chapter begins with someone who was involved with fornication with his father's wife, and it was in the church at Corinth. And so the Lord is moving the Apostle Paul to speak to that, and then he makes a point of speaking of the judgment of God concerning that individual, but then he does add verse 10, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. Yes, we don't want to get involved in pointing out people's sins because, well, you would never stop, and we have our own sins to take care of. But I don't think that was the focus of the call. It was more along the lines of, well, this individual maybe is concerned about participating in someone's sin. Now, that's a different story. If someone wants to do something sinful, we don't judge and we don't point the finger at them. But if they want us somehow to participate in that, well, that's a different matter. And in any of these kinds of sins, of course, like fornication, covetous, idolatry, we wouldn't touch that or go anywhere near it. But there are certain things that they're very difficult to discern.
Very good. Yeah. Okay. Very good. The thing about the Revelation 9 that you were just talking with the other gentleman about, I was just thinking that too, and he brought it up, and you reiterated or explained that how the third part again is judged in the judgment day by the angels in Revelation 9:14, and Euphrates equals Babylon, and of course we came out of Babylon on May 21st, 2011. Excellent. Really enjoyed that. It was just edifying, and I really liked on the study again the confirmation, the 7,000 years, and a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years a day. It's right on the money, so to speak. Also, the people that I've been associating with for years, they seem to grow colder. That's fine, harder, more adamant, giving me all kinds of verses from the Bible. Saying I don't take rebuke, correction, I'm a foul speaker, all that kind of stuff. And I take it to the Lord in the Word of God, and I just realize, unless, of course, God, some of these people haven't gone to church for a while, but most of them are in church. But again, I'm very comfortable with my relationship with Christ, and I believe this is a judgment day, and you're doing an excellent job. I think God is working through you, and really appreciate it, Chris. Keep feeding the sheep. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and for your call. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. In one of the Revelation 3 studies, I can't remember which one, but you went to Psalm 139 and talked about, that Christ was in the lower parts of the earth and all of his members were formed. And I was wondering if you could go over that again for the sake of those that are listening to question and answer and didn't hear the study. That was good.
Well, it might be a little complicated. I think it was when we were reading. Let's see, which verse was that in Revelation 3?
I think verse 5 or 6.
Verse 5, where it says, "And I will not blot out his name out of the book of life." And when
you're going through various places where it talks about the book of life.
Right, and when we do search the Bible, reading information about the book of life, we come to Psalm 139, which is a Psalm of David, and David we know is a type of Christ, and here he makes an unusual statement in verse 14 and following. "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." Now that's a very unusual statement, and it's just not correct. When if we look at it on a physical level, when David was in his mother's womb, he wasn't curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. But as we understand that David is a type of Christ, and Christ has not only was a body prepared for him when he entered into the human race, but he has a spiritual body that the Bible says is made up of all the elect. And when Jesus was suffering the wrath of God from the foundation of the world, that it was at that point that body really came together, because he paid for all their sins and therefore guaranteed the life of that body. The body was basically knit together at that point. And it says in verse 16 of Psalm 139, "Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. And it just fits very well into the fact that God did save a people for himself, who he speaks of his elect, whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world. And so all the members of Christ were written which in continuance were fashioned by his saving work, when as yet there was none of them. Of the people, no man was with me. We read, I think, in Isaiah, that mine own arm brought me salvation, and God did it alone. Those that he saved weren't even born. The world wasn't even created. It was from its foundation. And these verses just teach us that, and they're a beautiful description of the saving work of the Lord Jesus and the formation of the body of Christ in that redemption that he wrought for them from the foundation of the world. But thank you for your comments and bringing up these verses. And I would like to thank everyone for sharing your questions and your comments tonight. We have come to the end of our time, I'm sorry to say, but Lord willing, this coming Sunday afternoon during our online fellowship, we'll have another live question and answer at about 1:30 p.m. Please join us then if you can. For now, I'm going to say good night, and may the Lord's perfect will be done.
Thank you so much for joining us during this Friday evening questions and answers time. The broadcast is heard live over the Internet beginning at approximately 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You may also join our Sunday afternoon broadcast of EBible's Questions and Answers beginning at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Until then, may the Lord grant us his wisdom, and may his perfect will be done. Have a blessed evening. Good night.